Bioethics 2.0, Podcast Episode 12, Death and Dying. Podcast Objectives. 1. After viewing and listening to this podcast, you should understand the history that is behind the various definitions of death. 2. You should also understand what role nurses play in providing supportive care and caring for patients at the end of life.
Here are a couple of jokes to start off with. Death and taxes. These are the only two guarantees we have in life. Although now with the reform bill in the United States, we may be guaranteed some form of health insurance, so perhaps that might change. My wife, who's a critical care and nurse practitioner, also has a funny quote. Life is a terminal condition with a 100% mortality rate. I don't know if that's an original quote, but I like it nevertheless. We like to start off with a bit of levity in this particular topic because it's as funny as it's going to get.
One thing that we want to highlight in this podcast is how we have transformed dying. If you were to look back at any history book, novel, or media 100 years ago, or even 75 years ago, how we died was conventionally at home, surrounded by loved ones. Today, however, the place of death has changed. Now we die at hospitals, and many of us die alone. And usually no one is there to comfort us during the dying process. One of the reasons for this shift is the invention of healthcare technology. Now we have critical care interventions that can keep people physiologically maintained. There are a lot of things that we can do to you when we cease to do things for you. So sometimes that gives people more horror than hope. The ethics of treatment have changed as well. The ethics are currently that since we have all this technology available, we should always use it. That is the prevailing stance in healthcare. And most likely that is a good thing, because if you get hurt, you want someone who will diligently try to restore you back to health. So you want this ethic built into your healthcare providers. However, we may reach a point where there is not anything more that you can do for a patient, in which case you need to turn that ethic away from trying to cure to trying to provide comfort. Some clinicians still consider the act of withholding life-sustaining treatment as a type of passive euthanasia. They say, letting someone die is a dereliction of their duty as a healthcare professional. We are still seeing that to some extent, and it is still unfortunate. Death and dying. Why the shift in attitude continued.
We have ghettoized death. We send terminally ill patients to hospice, but not usually early enough. So they suffer in the hospital. And let's be honest, those that don't even make it to hospice receive far less attention and comfort care on acute care floors or units than patients who are terminally ill. The reason for this is because clinicians don't want to feel like they have to waste resources on patients they know are going to die.
In this section of the podcast, we will discuss several definitions of death. Before the influence of technology, how did we test for death? The whole body definition.
Before modern life-sustaining technology, defining death was a relatively simple matter. There were all sorts of innovative ways to test for death. Some included putting a mirror up to your nose, and if it fogged up, it meant there was respiration. Another way included looking for the rising and falling of the lungs and the chest, if someone's eyes were open. Sometimes you even gave someone a good kick in the side to see if they were alive. In the Victorian age, people were scared about being buried alive, so they invented a complicated system of air tubes to coffins, with a bell at the top that you could ring in case you woke up. So basically, our way of defining death before life-sustaining technology, while a relatively simple matter, was not very accurate. If you looked and acted dead, you were probably dead. That was the whole body definition of death. According to biological and physical functions, you were dead.
The whole brain definition.
The whole body definition is inadequate because of the ability to artificially maintain those who would have died on the basis of the heart-lung criteria. Back in the 1950s, the Harvard ad hoc committee met and decided that the whole brain definition of death, which spells out specific clinical criteria for determining brain death, is the standard that should be adopted. Many states have adopted this standard in their laws, although a few states still maintain a carve-out on the basis of religious belief for the whole body definition. One very notable example of that is the state of New Jersey. There are a variety of problems with the concept of brain death. For one, it's a very difficult concept for patients and their families to grasp. For most patients who are brain dead or who are going to be soon, they are being maintained on ventilator support. The fact that we can physiologically maintain a patient, keep them perfused so that their chest rises and falls, and that they are still pink from proper oxygenation, can pose difficulty for families. They see the patient as still alive. Many hope for miracles. So my wife, who's a critical care nurse practitioner, likes to say, brain dead is dead dead. It denotes how silly a term brain death is and can be. My recommendation is not to use the term with patients and their families. If someone has died according to neurological criteria, call them dead, not brain dead. Then it is permissible to withdraw all supporting technologies.
Brain death, some difficulties.
The problems with brain death extend beyond mere language. We have patients in persistent vegetative state, PVS, where the brainstem survives, but the patient has no or little neocortical function, no speech, no meaningful interaction, and that poses a problem for the whole brain definition of death. Some want to say what matters is consciousness, our ability to interact meaningfully with our environment. This is what has been termed the neocortical definition of death. I personally prefer the neocortical definition of death. However, that is not what is in law. What is in law is the whole brain definition of death. For me, it's all about what's going on upstairs. Yeah, if I wasn't able to play soccer, I would be very, very upset. But take a look at Stephen Hawking. He hasn't done a whole lot physically for a long time, and mentally, he's absolutely amazing. This points to the problem. Disability rights people argue that if you go to a neocortical definition of death, a lot of people for whom we care and love and have duties, who are being physiologically maintained, wouldn't they fall under that definition? So what do we do with them? Would we disconnect them? A lot of disability activists say it is not a good thing that we're making all kinds of judgments about people's quality of life. This is not an easy dilemma to get out of. There are three famous cases involving determination of death that warrant discussion. The first involves Karen Ann Quinlan. Quinlan overdosed on drugs at a party in New Jersey and lapsed into unconsciousness. She was diagnosed as being in a persistent vegetative state. After some time, her parents fought to have her respirator disconnected so that she could die. Her parents said that she wouldn't have wanted to be in such a state. Ultimately, the courts found that her statement amounted to an advance directive, and the respirator was removed. The next famous case took place in Missouri. Nancy Cruzan was a young woman who was involved in a car crash. She, too, was later diagnosed in a persistent vegetative state, and her parents battled to have her feeding tube removed. Unlike Quinlan, Cruzan had not made specific statements about not wanting to be in such a state. The result is that Missouri has one of the toughest legal standards for advance directives about removing life-sustaining technology. The standard that must be met in Missouri is that statements must be clear and convincing. The last and most recent case involved Florida woman Terry Schiavo. She had bulimia and suffered a heart attack due to electrolyte imbalances. She too was diagnosed in a persistent vegetative state. The battle here involved at first her husband, who said that on numerous occasions Terry had discussed that she wouldn't want to be kept alive on life-sustaining technologies. In contrast to this, Terry's parents, the Schindlers, had a different assessment. The battle was between who should legally and ethically have the right to make a decision for Terry as to whether life-sustaining technologies were maintained or not. The case became so polarized that the governor of Florida and then later the U.S. Congress became involved. Senator Frist even purported to dispute the diagnosis of persistent vegetative state over videotape when he is a cardiac surgeon, without qualifications or diagnostic tests or examinations in neurology. Regardless of which way people think this case should have gone, for me the real problem was the very disrespectful thing that we did to Terry. She was a very shy person in real life, and she would never have wanted her name and her case dragged before all the people that knew about it, including the U.S. Congress. That is the ethical disservice that we did to her as a culture. We basically made her a cause celeb in the Right to Die movement, and I don't think that that did justice to her in the end. Here we have a screenshot of Terry Schiavo's gravestone. She died in 2005. If you look closely at the bottom, it says, "I kept my promise." This gravestone was obviously made by her husband. And basically what he's saying is that she had 14 years of being tortured into living, that she was in fact brain dead.